So ever since Nintendo Switch Online launched back in 2018 originally, we have never heard any kind of update roadmap schedule officially from Nintendo. But over the years, we have seen trends and patterns that we can sometimes lock down and figure out loosely when to expect new content updates in terms of the console library that they now have, which by the way is up to 6 or 7 depending on how you count the consoles in terms of which one should be getting updates. And while we've expanded from originally just having NES then to SNES, we are now in an environment where it is NES, SNES, N64, Sega Genesis, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. And while that has certainly added a lot of value into the expansion pack price of the $50 annual charge that Nintendo has the service set at, there is now a new conversation to be had around the frequency for N64 games, because you may not have realized it, but it has been since the end of January that we have gotten an additional game in the N64 library. And in today's video, I want to break down and discuss the N64 content roadmap updates going forward, as we are into a more mature point with that console being available on the expansion pack, and have a broader discussion of where we should be setting our expectations overall as paying Nintendo Switch Online subscribers when it comes to new game updates going forward. What's up, Nation? If it's your first time on the channel, make sure you join Sunbro Nation by subscribing below, hit the like button on this video if you enjoy it today, and make sure you turn on your bell notification icon so you're kept up to date with all the newest gaming news. Now, as I mentioned, guys, today we're having a broad conversation around Nintendo Switch Online, and specifically the frequency at which we should expect new content updates, mainly around the N64 console, because you may remember that when that console launched back in October 2021, it had an initial launch lineup of games like all new consoles do, but we then saw Nintendo shift to a one new N64 game per month roadmap, if you will. While they never came out and said that that would be the frequency, that's what we saw them stick to for nearly a year after they'd started adding in additional content to the console at all. But what you may stop and realize with Nintendo consoles over the course of time is as they become more aged and established on the NSO service, it becomes more of an afterthought or an inconsistent update schedule, as we've seen happen now with N64 over the past few months. And I am well aware that we had a lot of updates to NSO in February with the most recent Direct, where they of course added in Game Boy family of systems, with Game Boy Advance being available only on the expansion pack, and the Game Boy and Game Boy Color being on the base tier service, which is great considering that if you do look at the NES and SNES library of games, we are at a point on the base tier where it is just a coin toss on if we will get updates for those libraries at all. And lately, when we have seen updates, unfortunately, they have been less than desirable titles. Nintendo clearly isn't paying licensing fees to get some of the more fan favorite NES and SNES games, and is rather going to that discount bin section of a old game store where you would find a lot of these NES and SNES games that they are adding in today. And while I don't think we're at that point with the N64 library yet, I do think it is interesting considering that January 26th, if I'm not mistaken, is the last date that we had a new N64 game drop into the service, which is GoldenEye. And to be fair, that was a giant update because it's one of the most sought after fan classic games that everybody wanted to play, and it launched in the service with online play, which is fantastic. There's some wonkiness with the controls on the Nintendo version. You can go through and remap your controller to make it play more like a modern shooter. You shouldn't have to do that, and you should be able to do it straight through the emulator app and not remap the system level controls, but that's neither here nor there. At least we got that giant game in. But you now have to realize we are in the month of April, and if we go to the end of April without seeing an N64 game update, we would actually be 3 full months without getting any kind of content update for that console on the service, and that is clearly the biggest draw for the expansion pack. Now, I should clarify that I am expecting us to get a N64 update this month, and I do think that's a fairly safe prediction because it's been long enough that we should see it updated. But you may remember in previous videos on the channel, we have discussed the idea that Nintendo may be going to a alternating update roadmap schedule for the expansion pack, where in months that we get a Game Boy Advance title like we saw in March with Metroid Fusion, we very well may see Nintendo not give us an N64 game. And this concern originally stemmed back to that September updated roadmap Nintendo Direct presentation, where they showed the new N64 games that would be coming, and they used the term gradually in terms of how they would be adding in those games to the service. And that to me seemed like the first step or first signal that we should expect less consistency around what we had seen Nintendo do up to that point, which is a consistent one new N64 game per month. And we are now clearly in that window, because even if we do get a game in the month of April, which I'm expecting that we will, that will still be a full 2-month gap without N64 content. Now, you can't argue that this might be a one-off because they launched new consoles. Clearly, February, it was a massive shadow drop with the update of the Game Boy family of systems going live on the service, and then they did turn around and already update those libraries in the month of March with a base tier update to NES, SNES, and the Game Boy system, and then we had Metroid Fusion, as mentioned, for the Game Boy Advance console. So that is at least a good sign for those systems, but those are also the newest systems out, and the N64 is, at this point in time, more aged and established on the service as it launched back in October 2021. So what should we expect for N64 games going forward? I think it comes down to every other month being the best case scenario, and sometimes we may go that 2.5 to 3 months without seeing any kind of update for the content for this console. And that's a shame, considering there are some games that fans really want to play. We have Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2 in the pipeline, but no commitment on when they will be added into the service. 1080 Snowboarding, I can't wait to replay. That's actually one that has a lot of childhood nostalgia for me. That one, we don't know when it will be added in. Will we get something where it's 2 games in the same month occasionally to kind of make up for the missed months? It's entirely possible, especially with games like Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2. We could see them do a repeat of what they did with Mario Party 1 and 2, where they added them both in the month of November of 2022, but you have to keep in mind that that is where we started to see the dwindling of the 1 per month being missed, because in the September month where they had that direct with the updated roadmap, we also did not get an N64 game update. And I think now that Game Boy family of consoles is the newest focus, we might see more consistent support for those, and hopefully we do see 1 per month Game Boy Advance games in addition to Game Boy games, but we very well could see an every other month or every 2 months scenario for N64, and that's kind of where I'm starting to set my expectations. And the frustrating part about this, I definitely think it could be perceived better by fans if Nintendo would just simply add in a monthly tier option for the expansion pack, because the issue that I have is we have to blindly trust them for 12 months of a payment for the expansion pack and hope that they add in enough content to make it worth it. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the Game Boy family of systems added in a ton of value to that $50 annual price point and definitely makes it more justifiable for many gamers, myself included. But if that comes at the expense of having less and less N64 games to look forward to, then that can be an issue as well. And it would just be nice to have some kind of communication from Nintendo around what they are doing with content updates on the service when you've already trusted them with a full 12 months of your money, similar to how Sony does it with PlayStation Plus. You know that you're going to get some games added into the service every single month just because you're a subscriber. They haven't missed that since they came out with PlayStation Plus, and that's one of the benefits that's outlined in their plan. When we are trusting Nintendo for 12 months, it would be nice to have a commitment from them, but instead we have PR agents from them actually on record saying that there's no planned schedule for Game Boy games when they were asked about it in terms of the frequency on when they will throw them on the service. And I think that this plays into Nintendo's big long play with the service, which is to roll it forward into the future Nintendo hardware, whatever's next, whether it's Nintendo Switch 2 or something entirely different. I do think Nintendo Switch Online does roll forward, and we've seen that in redacted documents from the Microsoft Activision Blizzard merger. We've also seen that infamous slide where Nintendo account value-added services roll forward into the future. And while I would like to see them have the one-off option to purchase these games, I really do think that the days of Virtual Console and purchasing these titles are a thing of the past, and Nintendo will double down on the subscription model just because of how much revenue it pulls into their bottom line. They know what they have here with a classic library of retro games that people want to play easily and conveniently on the go on the Switch or at home when docked, and they know that that is something that many users will shell out that monthly or annual fee for, and that's a big portion of their bottom line in their revenue generation now. So I think that they continue to slowly trickle out these updates for both games and eventually consoles. Something like GameCube could very well launch on the next generation Nintendo hardware for Nintendo Switch Online. I don't think we necessarily get it soon. I think we get all of the consoles we have today more built out and established with these drip feed style updates from Nintendo, and then one day when that well kind of runs dry, they drop in the next big thing, which is GameCube, and they probably at that point in time will offer in a higher price tier once again. But hey, if we're getting GameCube and Dreamcast or whatever they launch on the Sega side of things, I will be happily upgrading to that. But we don't know what Nintendo is doing with the service at the end of the day, and it is just interesting to me that if we go far into the month of April without getting an N64 game, we are quickly approaching the 3-month mark with no content, and that is where it kind of becomes a warning sign when you guys are considering on whether or not to renew your expansion pack service with Nintendo. Just know that while it has become way more valuable than it was when it first launched, not to mention all the emulation issues that were a thing on the N64, we are also going to get to this point where we can't consistently expect the same kind of content updates for all the consoles as we once did, specifically on the N64 side of things. But here's hoping we get a surprise announcement sometime soon within the next week or two that 1 or 2 N64 games are scheduled to launch on the service in the month of April. And if we're very lucky, we will see them also announce a Game Boy Advance game and maybe even Game Boy base tier games added into the service for the month of April, because while those are the new consoles, I do think that those are the ones we get the more consistent updates around. But I would love to see it all happen in the same month. If we don't get that and we only see N64 games added in, at that point we may be in an environment where we should expect one every other month to either get an N64 game to the expansion pack or to get a Game Boy Advance game, but not both. But I really want to hear from you guys at this point in the video, how you feel about Nintendo Switch Online, specifically the expansion pack, and where you feel like it sits today in terms of overall value. Are you happy with it and you're happy with what we're getting now with the larger library of consoles, or are you somebody who does think that we have to get updates for N64 games alongside of the Game Boy family of systems going forward in order for it to continue to justify that $50 annual price? And what would you like to see added into the service, whether it be in the immediate future or in the distant future? Because I know I would definitely like to see a trophy or achievement system as part of the online subscription service. Not everybody's a fan of that, but I certainly would be. And the more consoles, the better, as always. But regardless of your thoughts and feelings on everything we talked about today, I do look forward to hearing from you all in the comments down below before you leave the video, as I do look forward to getting a back and forth conversation started with you all around these topics. Go watch yesterday's video next if you haven't already, which is on screen right now. Also make sure you like, subscribe, turn on your notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.